Hello and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are studying 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 13, which does not finish all of 1 Corinthians. So this 1 Corinthians is the only epistle that we are spending 3 entire weeks on. We'll still get it again next week. I think the reason is there's so much doctrinal information in these chapters where you're like, oh, we could talk about that for a while. Oh, we could talk about that for a while. Like, if you're teaching a lesson, you're probably, as you're in 1 Corinthians, you're like, I'm not even sure where to focus because there's just a lot. And that is the case this week. We're going to dive into a lot of cool themes. Last week, you noticed Paul teaching a lot about unity to those Corinthians. This week, we'll see some new themes, although we're still sticking with unity. Unity is still a huge lesson here, but also talking about spiritual gifts, lots of other cool doctrines that we get to focus on. So Paul was writing this letter to the saints in Corinth. Right? The Corinthians, that's what that means. They're the people who live in Corinth. And Paul had a special place in his heart for these Corinthians, these saints in Corinth, because he was the one who had first established Christianity. He had taught them about the Messiah about 5 or 6 years prior. So he knew these people so well. He had spent about 2 years there. I just picture, like, there's such a difference between the way he spoke to the Romans in the epistle to the Romans, where he didn't really know anyone personally, versus these Corinthians, where he knows them. And also, when you know someone a little better, you know when they get off track and you know when they need a reminder, right? And so as you're reading 1 Corinthians, you might be thinking, the tone is a little, like, abrupt as Paul is writing, and I think that's absolutely the case. Like, he's teaching them things, of course, but he's also doing it while chastising them and telling them what they need to do to correct themselves. And we'll see, looking ahead in the second letter to the Corinthians, how they respond to the first letter to the Corinthians. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I think it's interesting to just kind of notice the different tones that Paul takes with different people, right? So 1 Corinthians, he knows these people. He's going to tell them what's up. He's going to tell them what they need to change. He's learning that they're splitting themselves up by who baptized them. And he's like, that's not how this works. That's not how this works. That's why there's so much speak of unity in a lot of these. And then add on top of that, we have that Jews and Gentiles can get baptized, and Gentiles getting baptized, like, that's a completely different culture than what these Jews grew up believing. These Gentiles were worshiping all sorts of different gods, right? Think ancient Greece and Rome. Like, this is what these people were believing. They are converting to Christianity, and they're bringing a lot of different cultural ideas and other things with them. And the Jews are rejecting that, and the Gentiles are rejecting the Jews. And so they need this huge lesson on unity, how to work together when there are differences, because there will always be differences. There will always be ways to split ourselves up. Always. It's natural. But how do we still work together? How do we find unity? How do we focus on Jesus, on what really matters the most? As a reminder, like, zooming out, this is probably around the year 55 AD. It is so hard to, like, date these epistles, by the way. Pretty much anything that Paul does is, like, around these 3 possible years. So around 55 AD, and it matches up with about Acts 18 and 19. So when we were studying Acts 18 and 19, that's when we see Paul is in Ephesus. He's writing this letter to the Corinthians. Last week we talked about how we can infer that Paul had written a letter to the Corinthians. They had written a letter back to him asking some questions. And now this letter, 1 Corinthians, is the letter he's responding back to their questions. That's why we see a lot of kind of abrupt changes in subject. We can assume that he's responding to the questions that these Corinthians had written him about. Okay, let's talk about specifically some of these questions, because I think it's interesting as we go through each of the chapters. Chapter 8, the first one we read this week, is like a very different one. First of all, it starts off, Paul is preaching about charity and love, and it's great. And then all of a sudden he starts talking about sacrificial meat. And you're like, what what is going on? Let me give you a little bit of background information. So when people would sacrifice to pagan gods, so not the real God, right? They'd have their own little ceremonies and they'd sacrifice to pagan gods. They would take the meat that they would sacrifice and they'd split it into 3 parts, okay? The first part would be burned as part of the sacrifice. The second part would be given to the person, like the patron, the person who's there making the sacrifice. And then the third part would be given to the priest, right? These are, again, not Jewish priests. These are pagan priests, just using that title. It would be given to the pagan priests, and they could either eat it or they could sell it. And if you sell it, that's actually a great way to make a living as a priest. And so I kind of ended up that that's how a lot of people got their meat, is they purchased it from priests who were getting their third portion from the sacrifices that people were making to the pagan gods, right? And so these saints are writing to Paul and they're saying, is it bad for us to buy and eat that meat? Which I want you to just think for a second. What do you think Paul's response would be? I just think it's an interesting concept with maybe some parallels. I don't know. Paul responded and said, listen, if you know that you are not worshiping gods, pagan gods, you're just eating meat that you're purchasing, that's fine. There's no issue there. You know in your heart what you're doing. But other people might not know what you're doing. In fact, what you do, if you choose to buy this meat and eat it from these pagan priests, that might end up being a stumbling block for them on their journey to understand what you actually believe. So kind of an interesting is that he didn't say blanket yes, he didn't say blanket no. He said, yes, of course it's fine because you know you're not worshiping pagan gods, but consider how your actions can have an effect on other people when they're making judgment calls, when they're assuming what you believe. I don't know. Kind of interesting. Okay, chapter 9, Paul's talking about he's an apostle. He is willingly serving the people around him. He loves to go different places and just wholeheartedly serve those people. He's awesome. And he advises us to run the race and to master our bodies. Chapter 10, Paul reminds them of their ancestors and how they were delivered out of captivity in Egypt, and then they were fed in the wilderness. And he then warns them about sins because they need to be looking out for sins just like their ancestors were warned about sins in the wilderness as well. So, of course, there's sins that we need to look out for if our ancestors were warned for sins too. And he kind of talks about some of those sins, and he says that we will never be tempted above that which we can bear when we partner with Jesus. And he talks about the true communion that should happen with Jesus when we partake of the sacrament, and how that's very different than what happens in pagan sacrifices. A little compare and contrast there. Chapter 11, one thing you're going to want to know is the word heresies, H-E-R-E-S-I-E-S, heresies. It means like factions, different groups of a church, right? Of anything really, but factions, groups of people. And Paul he starts by clearly answering some questions about grooming guidelines and if men and women should cover their heads when they pray. So just read that to see Paul's culturally relevant answers for that time. And then talking about how the woman is not without the man, neither is the man without the woman. And he says that factions will pop up in the church in order to test the faithful. They will test the faithful when factions pop up. Chapter 12, this is a very famous, amazing chapter about the gifts of the Spirit. Paul lists a lot of gifts of the Spirit. Of course, he doesn't list all of them, but he lists a lot. And talking about that Jews and Gentiles are so different, but yet they work together like one body with lots of different body parts that all have different functions. And in the church, there's prophets and teachers and preachers and priests. Everyone has these different roles, and yet we're all working together for the same purpose. We're all using our spiritual gifts in different ways to accomplish the same work. And then he adds that we can request and seek after new gifts. We can request new spiritual gifts. And finally, chapter 13, another fantastic chapter, this one focusing on good works and faith are nothing without charity. And Paul says that charity never faileth. We know that, right? And beautiful preachings about charity in chapter 13. Okay, so you see how that, it kind of like jumps from chapter to chapter what he's talking about, but so many great doctrines this week. I think you'll enjoy studying this middle portion of 1 Corinthians. I think my personal focus question, spiritual gifts, I love that topic. I think it's really powerful as you study 1 Corinthians 12 to think about, of course, what spiritual gifts do I possess? And I like to think of them more on a spectrum, right? Sometimes we're like, I have this, I have that, I don't have that. But I think everything's on a spectrum, right? Like we can possess certain gifts to some degree, and maybe we're better at it than we were 10 years ago. We have more of the gift now than we did 10 years ago, but we still would like to improve. And so thinking about the gifts that I have in any capacity, and then what gifts would I like to request? Now this is tricky because immediately sometimes our brains can go into like fun things like, I want the gift of tongues, that sounds great. But of course, keeping in mind that gifts are meant to edify others. Edify others. So what is a gift that I could hopefully seek after and maybe possess to a greater degree that could bless the lives of the people around me? Food for thought. All right, have a great week this week studying the middle part of 1 Corinthians, and happy studying.